do not have the privilege to ignore the impacts the climate crisis is already having on our own communities.
I feel like my rights are denied because human rights is the same as climate justice rights.
People have dropped out of school. Some have been married off. We're talking about survival here.
Climate change is devastating the lives of close to 500 million children across Africa. It's destroying their health, their education, their homes, and their future. And it's happening right now. As Kenya faces the most severe drought in 40 years, the Tana River, which supplies 80% of the capital's water, is struggling to keep up. Joy and her family are among millions of Nairobi residents who do not have access to a reliable source of clean water. It's an issue that is especially evident in urban areas where people are unable to connect to piped water infrastructure. Every day, Joy and her father are forced to take the long 1-kilometer walk with their jerry cans in hand, sometimes more than once a day. They often have to wait in line for their turn, as the collection point is only open for about 12 hours a day. As for fresh water to cook and drink, the family depends on the bottled water distributed by the City Council 4 days a week. Eric Njuguna is a youth activist from Nairobi.
Last year, the president declared drought a national emergency because of the lack of access to water. Here in Nairobi specifically, when water levels become lower, it has a ripple effect in the sense that it leads to water rationing, and economically disadvantaged communities are disproportionately affected because the prices of water end up becoming higher.
1 in 5 children worldwide do not have enough water to meet their everyday needs. Most of these children live in East and Southern Africa.
If you think about the climate crisis, it's all about water. More water here, less water here at the wrong time or at the wrong place. It's all about water.
To the west, near Lake Victoria, water levels are rising, causing floods and choking aquatic life, leaving fishermen without a means for income.
We've experienced floods, and that has really destroyed our roads, has destroyed like the businesses, places, has displaced many people. So that has really devastated the country because we really rely on tourism, and that means it also scares away tourists.
Africa as a continent is very different in terms of weather and environmental conditions. We are seeing, for instance, excess rain. We saw the cyclone which hit Mozambique. We saw this hitting Zimbabwe as well, Madagascar. So we are seeing excess rainfall in some parts, while we are seeing reduced rainfall in others.
As an African girl, I feel like my rights are denied, my climate justice rights, because human rights is the same as climate justice rights. And I feel like the government needs to do much more.
If you think about the right to a clean environment, it's as important as the right to food. Children's rights are under threat. Most important is especially the rights that are about life and survival. A clean environment, the right to food, right to adequate nutrition, right to water especially, because these sustain life. But it doesn't mean that the right to education is much less, because as we are seeing with climate change is affecting all rights.
In northern Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia, pastoralist communities, or herders, are those heaviest hit. After 4 seasons without rain and a 5th one looming, these families have completely lost their source of income. Without water, there is no pasture. Without pasture, their livestock dies. And so the men migrate with their herds, looking for pasture, leaving behind the women and children, left to fend for themselves.
We've seen cases of number of children dropping out of school, looking for water, traveling kilometers to look for water, and that puts them in harm's way, having girls being raped, boys getting into trouble and drugs.
The number of children at risk of dropping out of school has tripled in just 3 months.
We're talking about survival here, basically food to eat and not even thinking of education.
wal uniformka gaadona male wal oo meeleray buuk gaadona male saasay darteen isku dhaafi ayle kaalme idile rooge walan qowdo male.
In Somalia, 1 million people are now displaced by drought. Thousands of families are taking the long, perilous journey towards Baidoa in hopes to find help. Fatun and her family walked for 10 days without any food and barely any water.
Bahadagtee dagaalan ku tamni hoolagaano dhamaati anuun meeleray biilaan hiridi beero aanu wal makaban saas darteew unwa diile dhamaane halber biya dhamaan geesha kaleetan deeran hiraabtee lay deeran.
Most women and children make the journey alone, without men around to protect them, and face yet another danger, being raped. But they make the journey anyway, hoping to find help on the other side. Food, water, and getting their children checked for malnutrition.
For a long time, Africa was making progress in terms of addressing malnutrition, but now we are going back and we're seeing child hunger is increasing. Food insecurity has become a problem. Because of that, food prices have gone up, living costs have gone up, so African children are not having the basic 3 meals a day. They're undernourished, they're not getting the basic elements of nutrition that they need.
Another alarming consequence is the rising number of young girls being forced into marriage. It's an act of desperation, as families are pushed to the edge and struggling to survive. By marrying off their daughters, they're hoping for a dowry and one less mouth to feed.
When families face pressure in terms of food, they resort to survival mechanisms. And how do they survive? One, they marry off girls. And so child marriage has already been documented to be going up. Second, they send children into child labor. Typically in the rural areas, it's the responsibility of young girls to fetch water, to fetch firewood. It means one, they have less time to go to school. It means two, that they are at increased risk out there. And so the impacts on children are so complex and interrelated that we are saying really climate change is something that is going to threaten children in all ways that a child needs to be a child.
"35 out of 45 countries globally identified as the worst affected by climate change are in sub-Saharan Africa. That affects 490 million children under the age of 18.
It's unfortunate that Africa and a lot of the other developing countries have the least contribution, but are facing the greatest effects. And so this is really a moment for us to emphasize that point of responsibility. Responsibility in terms of what the different countries of the world need to do in order to mitigate these effects of climate change on Africa as a continent, but specifically on the most fragile and vulnerable countries and groups.
But despite the impact on millions of children, little has been done to strengthen the humanitarian response and commit governments to real solutions.
I went to Stockholm Plus 50 in Sweden, and what shocked me about it is that these climate talks have been ongoing for the past 50 years. It scares me as a youth activist to think that we have around 10 years to solve what 50 years of climate action hasn't.
Eric was a delegate for UNICEF and Fridays for Future at COP26. Across Africa, youth activism is surging, with high school students all over the continent creating their own environmental groups, organizing rallies, and speaking up for their right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment.
Climate change has actually affected the children from where I come from. Youths like me should be important for us to be climate activists because we are the voice, and with our voice we can actually advocate for the next future generation because we are the young leaders of today.
Local organizations and grassroots movements are not waiting for world leaders to find immediate solutions to alleviate their plight. But the gravity of the situation requires urgent action.
To re-emphasize for the umpteenth time the urgency with which we need to act. Because every day is a lost day. We are seeing the projections of what climate change is going to look like in Africa by 2050. It's going to mean that really Africa, with a population of 1 billion children by then, will be essentially facing a very bleak future and a very dark future for its children. We also want to remind duty bearers, be they governments, transnationals, that there has to be shared responsibility. But this shared responsibility, however, cannot be shared 50-50. We cannot talk about survival, we cannot talk about sustainable development, about all these aspirations that we have laid down, unless we safeguard our children. So it's really about safeguarding our children, protecting our children, or else there will be really no future for Africa.